I stopped counting days somewhere around 140. Then I started again because the silence was doing something to my head, and I needed numbers to hold on to, the way a kid needs to count stairs going down into a dark basement. So I carved notches into the stock of my rifle with the tip of a screwdriver. One notch per sunrise. When I hit 200, I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because I'd outlasted every single prediction I'd made about myself. 200 days since Fort Whitmore went dark. I was a PFC, private first class, which in peacetime means you carry things, you stand where they tell you to stand, and you learn how to look busy in a way that satisfies sergeants. I was 23. My MOS was 25 uniform, signal support system specialist, which meant I maintained radios and repeaters and ran cable through mud. I wasn't infantry. I wasn't trained for what came after. Nobody was trained for what came after. Day 12 was when I left. The word is deserted, and I won't dress it up. The base perimeter had been breached twice overnight. 3 soldiers in my barracks were bitten in the second breach and zip-tied to cots while someone radioed for guidance that never came. Sergeant Diaz told us to hold positions. I watched Private Kerrigan, a 19-year-old from Boise who collected vintage baseball caps. I watched him turn in his restraints over a span of 40 minutes. His eyes went from scared to empty to something else. Something that looked at us the way a dog looks at a food bowl. I was standing 6 feet from him when Diaz shot him in the head. The sound was enormous. Not the gunshot. I'd heard hundreds of those. The sound of everyone in the room understanding simultaneously that the rules were over. I left before dawn. I took my rifle, 2 MREs, a sleeping bag, a hand crank radio I'd been repairing, and a pair of wire cutters. I went through the east fence where the concertina had been torn up by what we were still calling the affected. The snow was ankle deep, which was early from Montana, and my boots left a trail so clean you could have followed me from orbit. Nobody followed. That was the part I didn't understand then. I'd been so terrified of the court-martial, of the pursuit, of Diaz sending someone after me, that I ran for 16 hours straight through the Bitterroot foothills. I didn't sleep for 2 days. I jumped at bird sounds. I built no fires. I moved like something hunted. On day 15, I found a fire lookout tower with the ladder still down. I climbed it, pulled the ladder up behind me, and spent 3 nights in a glass box above the trees, watching the world with binoculars I'd found in the cabin at the top. What I saw? Nothing. No helicopters, no convoy dust, no patrols. Below, 2 infected stumbled through a creek bed half a mile east, their movements jerky and awful, but they passed without looking up. No one was coming for me. I told myself that was good news. Survival, right? Freedom. I could move however I wanted, eat when I found food, sleep when it was safe. I was a ghost. I'd gotten away. The truth took longer. The truth was that I didn't matter enough to chase. A PFC who fixes radios. Not a medic, not a squad leader, not someone carrying codes or intel. I was a 23-year-old cable runner who panicked and bolted through a broken fence, and Sergeant Diaz probably noted it in a log that nobody would ever read and moved on to the next crisis within minutes. But on day 200, I didn't know that yet. I still thought I was running. The Bitterroot Range in January is no place for a person. Temperatures below 0 at night. Snow that doesn't melt for months. I'd learned to move along ridge lines where wind kept the drifts shallow, to sleep in rock overhangs padded with pine boughs, to melt snow in my canteen against my body because building fires was a calculated risk every time. Smoke is visible for miles. The infected don't seem to notice it, but people do. And by month 4, I'd learned that people were worse. I hadn't spoken aloud in 61 days. The thing about being alone that long is that it doesn't break you the way movies suggest. There's no dramatic unraveling, no talking to volleyballs. It's more like erosion. You wake up one morning and realize you've forgotten the sound of your own name. Not the word. I could see Corporal Marinault on my dog tags anytime I wanted, but the sound of someone else saying it, the specific vibration of being called. That vanishes, and in its place is a flatness, like someone turned down the color saturation on the world by 10% every week until everything is gray but technically still visible. I ate pine bark. I ate a porcupine I killed with a rock, and it tasted like a miracle, even though I gagged twice cooking it. I ate frozen service berries I found in a thicket and spent the night so sick I thought about whether dying from dysentery was better or worse than turning. At least dysentery was just death, just the regular kind. The infected were sparse at elevation. I'd see one every few days, usually alone, sometimes in pairs. The cold slowed them. Their muscles stiffened. I watched one try to climb a slope near a frozen creek and fall repeatedly, its fingers too rigid to grip. It was almost pitiful. Almost. Then it turned its head toward me across 300 yards of open snow and started crawling, and pity evaporated like spit on a wood stove. I shot it from distance. Sound discipline be damned. There are moments where the need to end something overpowers the logic of staying quiet. By month 5, I had a routine. Move south-southwest during the day along the ridgelines. Look for sheltered spots before 3 p.m. when the temperature starts its real drop. Set snares where I see rabbit tracks. Collect water. Maintain the rifle. Crank the radio every third evening and scan frequencies for 20 minutes. The radio was habit, not hope. For the first 100 days, I'd heard fragments. Military channels barking grid coordinates. A civilian station out of Missoula that played pre-recorded weather forecasts on a loop until it cut to static on day 67. Once a woman's voice reading Bible verses in a calm, flat tone that went on for 6 hours before I turned it off because it was making me feel something I couldn't afford. By day 150, the frequencies were mostly dead. Occasional static bursts that might have been atmospheric, might have been someone keying a mic. I couldn't tell. The silence on the airwaves matched the silence in the mountains, and eventually scanning felt like pressing your ear to a wall in an empty house. Technically possible that someone's there, functionally pointless. But I kept cranking, because the radio was the last piece of my old job. The last thing that made me a signal specialist instead of just a woman freezing to death in the Bitterroot Range with a stolen rifle and no orders. Day 200 started like every other day. Gray sky, wind from the north, temperature around 10 below, based on how fast the moisture in my nose froze when I inhaled. I packed my sleeping bag, strapped it to my frame pack, checked the rifle, and started walking. The ridgeline I'd been following for 2 days curved west, and I could see where it dropped into a valley that was choked with snow. Deep snow, the kind that would swallow me to the waist and burn calories I didn't have. I was looking for a way around when the ground shifted under my right boot. Not a slide, not ice. The snow just dropped, maybe 18 inches. And I heard a sound underneath, a hollow metallic sound, like stepping on the roof of a car buried in sand. I froze, tested my weight. The surface held but felt wrong. I knelt, brushed snow away with my glove, and found green-painted corrugated steel. My heart rate tripled before my brain caught up. I knew what this was. Not specifically, not yet, but the shape, the paint, the corrugation. Military. Some kind of structure, buried under what had to be years of accumulated snow, not just this winter's worth. The drifts were packed dense and layered. This had been here a long time. I spent 20 minutes clearing enough to find the edge of the roof, then followed it to where it met a slope and, underneath 4 feet of compacted snow, a door. Steel. Painted the same faded green. A hasp with a padlock so rusted the shackle snapped when I hit it with the butt of my rifle. The door opened inward. The smell hit at me first. Cold stale air, machine oil, and something organic underneath. Old paper, old wool. I clicked on the small flashlight I'd scavenged from a gas station on day 39, and the beam cut into a room that made my breath stop. The cabin was roughly 15 by 20 feet. Low ceiling, I could touch it if I reached up. Steel walls insulated with some kind of fiber batting that had yellowed but held. A wooden floor, actual planking, laid over the steel base. Along the left wall, a metal shelf unit holding olive drab containers, each stamped with codes I half recognized from supply manuals. Along the right wall, a folding cot with a sleeping bag rolled on top of it, a small wood stove with a chimney pipe disappearing into the ceiling, and a footlocker. In the back corner, seated in a folding chair with his head against the wall, was a man. I raised the rifle before I processed anything else. Training, what little I had. He didn't move. His eyes were closed. His skin was the color of old candle wax. He wore Woodland BDUs. The old pattern, not the newer OCP I'd been issued. And his boots were unlaced. A wool blanket was draped across his lap. On the floor next to him was a canteen, a folding knife, and a green notebook. He was breathing. The breaths were shallow and widely spaced, the kind you can barely detect unless you're watching for chest movement. But his chest moved. A faint wheeze accompanied each inhale, like air pushed through a wet straw. Not infected. The infected don't sit, don't close their eyes, don't wrap themselves in blankets. The infected are kinetic. Always moving, always oriented towards sound or motion. This man was still in a way that only the very sick or the very exhausted can be. I stood in the doorway for a full minute, rifle up, flashlight beam on his face. His features were gaunt, mid-30s maybe. Dark hair cropped close but growing out unevenly. A patchy beard, dog tags visible at his collar. "Hey," I said. My voice sounded alien, cracked and thin, like a radio with a dying battery. 61 days of silence had turned my vocal cords into something neglected. His eyes opened. Not fast, not startled. Slow, like someone surfacing from deep water. He looked at me. At the rifle, the flashlight, my face. And he said one word. "Water." I didn't lower the rifle. I scanned the room again. No other doors. No other occupants. One entrance. One man. I stepped inside far enough to reach the canteen on the floor, shook it in empty, and set it down again. "I've got some," I said. "How long have you been here?" He blinked. Processing. "What day is it?" "Around 200, since the outbreak." He exhaled, a long, rattling breath. 36 days, roughly. I pulled my own canteen from my pack and held it out at arm's length, keeping the rifle in my right hand. He took it with both hands. They were shaking. He drank in small, careful sips, which told me he'd been rationing a long time and his body knew not to flood itself. "I'm Marin," I said. "PFC, Signal Support, Fort Whitmore." He lowered the canteen, looked at me again. "Vasquez, Staff Sergeant, 41st Signal Battalion." The same battalion. Not my company, not my platoon, but the same battalion. Housed in the same cluster of buildings on the same base I'd run from on day 12. "You're from Whitmore," I said. "Was," he said, "like you." The word "like" hung between us. Two people from the same place found in the same mountains, both very far from where they were supposed to be. He was a staff sergeant. I was a PFC. In the old world, that gap was everything. Rank, authority, chain of command. In this room, it meant nothing except that we'd both ended up here, and one of us was dying. I could see it clearly now. His color wasn't just pale from the cold. There was a grayness around his eyes, a hollowness in his cheeks that went beyond hunger. His breathing had a wet rattle that suggested fluid in the lungs. Pneumonia, maybe, or worse. On the shelf nearest to him, I noticed a radio. Olive drab housing, heavy, older model. A PRC-77 or similar. Vietnam era field radio, the kind that gets passed down through reserves and National Guard units that never get new equipment. Beside it, a hand-crank generator. And beside that, taped to the shelf with brittle masking tape, a laminated card with frequencies written in grease pencil. Signal equipment, in a forgotten Army cabin, maintained by a dying signal NCO for my own battalion. I lowered the rifle for the first time. Vasquez talked in fragments that first night. I got the stove going. The chimney was partially blocked with ice, which took an hour to clear by running a stick up the pipe. But once the draft opened, the small firebox heated the cabin to something livable within 30 minutes. The wood stove was an old Yukon model meant for exactly this kind of structure. Whoever had built this place had thought it through. While the room warmed, I inventoried the shelves. 12 olive drab containers. 4 held MREs, military vintage, some with date stamps from the early 2000s, but still sealed in their pouches. 2 held medical supplies. bandages, iodine tablets, a bottle of broad-spectrum antibiotics that had expired in 2019, and a foil sleeve of acetaminophen. 3 held ammunition, mostly 5.56 NATO, which fit my rifle. 1 held batteries, all dead. 1 held tools. A folding and trenching tool, pliers, wire, a hand crank flashlight. The last held blankets and a second sleeping bag, enough to sustain 2 people for maybe 3 weeks. Maybe less, depending on Vasquez. Civil defense cash, he said when he saw me reading the container stamps. He'd pulled himself more upright against the wall, the blanket tighter around his shoulders. Built in the 60s, part of a network, the Army set them up along mountain corridors in case of nuclear exchange. Communication relay points. How'd you know about it? I didn't, he coughed. Wet, deep, the kind that made me step back instinctively, even though I knew coughs weren't how the infection spread. Found the coordinates in a file at Whitmore. Operations office. I was looking for another cough. He pressed his fist to his mouth. I was looking for anything after you left the base. He met my eyes. He was too tired for pretense. After I left. Yeah. I didn't ask him when. I didn't want to compare timelines. I didn't want to calculate who ran first. What I did instead was open the footlocker. Inside, a logbook, green hardcover, standard military issue. The entries were in Vasquez's handwriting, and I could tell because his green notebook matched the penmanship. The first entry was dated roughly day 164 by my count. He'd arrived here 36 days ago. He'd been in better shape then. The entries described repairs to the stove, clearing the chimney, organizing supplies. He'd found the radio, assessed it, determined it was functional but limited in range without an antenna tall enough to clear the terrain. He'd started building one. The logbook described cutting pine poles, stripping wire from the supply container, improvising insulators from glass bottles he'd found in a garbage pit 50 meters downhill. An antenna mast assembled in sections, designed to be raised outside and guyed with wire. He'd completed everything except raising it. The final entry, 4 days old, read, Fever. Can't stand long enough. Mast section staged by door. Instructions in the green notebook. If someone finds this, the relay can work. Frequencies on card. Power from hand crank. 40 minutes of cranking gives roughly 12 minutes of transmit time. This can reconnect the Bitterroot corridor. I read that entry 3 times. You built a relay station, I said. Almost. His voice was thinner now. The warmth was making him drowsy, which was dangerous for someone with fluid in their lungs. The antenna is the last piece. It needs to go up on the ridge above us. 6 sections of pine, lashed together. Maybe 20 feet total. The wire runs down to the radio. And then what? Then anyone with a receiver within 60 miles hears the broadcast. Civilian, military, whoever's left. Vasquez, there might not be anyone left. There is. He said it with a certainty that irritated me. Certainty was a luxury. I heard them before the fever. Scan the frequencies on the card. There's a settlement signal east of here. Low power, repeating. Just coordinates and a welcome message. Someone set up a community and they're broadcasting their location. I looked at the frequency card taped to the shelf. 8 frequencies listed. 2 were military tactical channels I recognized. The rest were civilian. Why didn't you answer? Because a 2-watt signal from this radio won't reach them through these mountains without a proper antenna. The terrain eats it. That's the whole point of the relay. Get the antenna above the ridgeline, retransmit at enough height to clear the terrain shadow. Then they hear it. Then anyone in the corridor hears it. He closed his eyes. His breathing was labored now. Each exhale a small production. And then what? I asked again. Then people know they're not alone. I sat on the floor across from him and ate a cracker from one of the MREs. The salt tasted like a revelation. I hadn't had salt in weeks. That broadcast will include our position, I said. That's the idea. Anyone who hears it knows exactly where this cabin is. Yes, including whatever's left of the military. He opened his eyes. He understood what I was saying. A deserter's broadcast from a forgotten relay point. A signal with a return address sent by someone who fled. "Marin," he said, "there's no court-martial coming. There's no military justice system processing AWOL cases. There's nobody sitting at a desk at Fort Whitmore with your service record open. You don't know that. I was there 49 days longer than you." That landed. I set the cracker down. He told me about those 49 days in pieces over the next several hours, while the stove ticked and the cabin walls creaked under the weight of snow above. The story came out disordered, the way real memory works, not chronological, but organized by emotional gravity, the heaviest things surfacing first. Fort Whitmore had held for 3 weeks after my departure. Sergeant Diaz consolidated the remaining personnel into Building 4, the armory complex, which had the thickest walls and the most defensible entry points. They sealed the windows with plywood and furniture. They rationed MREs. Diaz ran a tight operation. Vasquez gave her credit for that. Real credit, not the grudging kind. "She kept 47 people alive for 21 days, he said. "That's not nothing." On day 33, a convoy from Joint Base Lewis McChord arrived. 12 vehicles. They weren't rescue. They were consolidation. Pulling assets back to a defensible line further west. DS was ordered to evacuate all personnel. She complied. Vasquez helped load the vehicles. "Everyone went?" I asked. "Everyone who was there," which meant everyone except the ones who'd already left. He didn't say, "except you." He didn't need to. The convoy made it 90 miles before a bridge collapse on I-90 forced a detour onto secondary roads. The detour ran through a small town. Vasquez couldn't remember the name, or wouldn't say it. Where the infected were concentrated in numbers none of them had seen before. Hundreds, moving together, not coordinated exactly but flowing like water through the streets toward the sound of the engines. 3 vehicles were lost, the convoy fragmented. Vasquez's truck, carrying 8 soldiers and the battalion's communication equipment, broke east toward the mountains. The others went west. No radio contact was reestablished. "We drove until we ran out of road," he said. "Then we walked. 8 of us, then 6, then 4. He didn't explain the arithmetic. I didn't ask. The 4 survivors found a Forest Service cabin and stayed 2 weeks. One of them, a corporal named Fitch, had a broken ankle from the convoy wreck. They splinted it. It got infected. Not the outbreak kind. The regular kind, bacterial, red-streaked skin, fever. Without antibiotics, Fitch died on a Tuesday afternoon while the others were out checking snares. "He was alone when it happened," Vasquez said. "That's what I think about. Not the dying, the alone." After Fitch, the remaining 3 moved deeper into the mountains. Vasquez, a specialist named Tron, and a lieutenant named Oberg. Oberg was infantry, the only one with real combat training. Tran was a mechanic. Vasquez was signal. 3 people with 3 skill sets that didn't overlap, which should have made them a functional unit. It didn't. Oberg wanted to push west and link up with whatever remained of the Lewis McChord consolidation. Vasquez wanted to establish a communication relay using the skills and equipment he had. Tran wanted to stay put and wait. 3 people, 3 plans, Vasquez said, and none of us ranked high enough over the others to pull authority. Oberg had rank on paper, but out here that means nothing unless someone agrees it does. They separated on day 119. No argument, no blow-up. They woke up one morning and Oberg was packed and ready to walk west. Tran said she'd go with him. Vasquez said he wouldn't. They shook hands. Oberg gave Vasquez his extra magazines. Tran gave him her lighter. "Did they make it?" I asked. "I don't know. I won't know. That's the actual texture of this. You lose people and the not knowing becomes permanent." He found the cabin 16 days later, using coordinates from a file he'd photographed on his phone before Whitmore's evacuation. The phone was dead by then, but he'd transcribed the coordinates onto paper, and his land navigation was solid. He arrived, dug out the door, and found exactly what we were sitting in. A Cold War relic, stocked and forgotten, with a radio that could change the map if someone raised an antenna above the mountains. He'd spent 36 days trying. He'd gotten close, and then his body had failed him in the most ordinary way possible. A respiratory infection born from cold and exhaustion that antibiotics could have fixed in the old world, but that was now sufficient to pin a staff sergeant to a folding chair and wait. The green notebook, he said. It has everything, every measurement, every step. The antenna sections are outside by the door. All someone needs to do is carry them up the ridge and assemble them. Someone, I said. He looked at me the way Diaz used to look at privates who were pretending not to understand an order. Marin, you're a signal specialist. I was a cable runner. You completed the same basic signal course I did. You know how RF propagation works. You know what a dipole is. You know why height matters. I ran cable through mud and plugged in junction boxes. And now you're going to raise an antenna and plug in a junction box. The mud is just frozen. I almost smiled. Almost. Then the weight of what he was asking settled over me like the snow on the roof above us. Raising that antenna meant broadcasting. Broadcasting meant being heard. Being heard meant being found. And for 188 days, my entire survival strategy, my entire identity, had been organized around the single principle that being found was the worst thing that could happen. I spent the night on the second cot, inside the second sleeping bag, with the stove banked low to conserve the small stack of firewood Vasquez had cut before his fever. It was the warmest I'd been in months. My body didn't know how to process it. I kept waking in a panic, convinced the warmth meant something was wrong. Fire, fever, someone close enough to radiate heat. Each time I'd orient myself. Steel ceiling, stove glow, Vasquez's breathing across the room. His breathing was worse by morning. The wet rattle had deepened into something that sounded structural, as though the fluid wasn't just in his lungs, but in the architecture of his chest. He was conscious but slow, each word costing effort. I gave him 2 of the expired antibiotics from the medical container. They were 3 years past date, and I had no idea if amoxicillin degraded into something harmful or just something useless. But doing nothing felt worse than doing the wrong thing. He swallowed them with water and didn't comment on the expiration. He'd seen the bottles. He knew. Tell me about the antenna, I said. He directed me to the green notebook. I sat cross-legged on the floor and read it cover to cover while the morning light filtered through a gap I'd cleared at the door. The notebook was meticulous. Vasquez wrote the way signal NCOs are trained to document. Clear, sequential, assumption-free. Each step was described as though the reader had never seen the equipment before. He'd included diagrams, measurements, a hand-drawn map showing the ridgeline above the cabin, and an X marking the optimal antenna site. A rocky outcrop roughly 400 meters uphill and 200 meters laterally along the ridge, with a clear line of sight east, south, and west. The antenna itself was simple in concept. 6 pine poles, each about 4 feet long, trimmed straight and lashed end to end with wire to form a mast. At the top, a horizontal element made from copper wire, stripped from the supply container, a half-wave dipole, cut to the frequency of the repeating settlement signal he'd heard. Feed line running down the mast and along the ground back to the cabin's radio. Simple in concept. In execution, it meant carrying 60 pounds of pine poles and wire up a mountainside in deep snow, in below-zero wind, in terrain where one wrong step could twist an ankle or worse. It meant spending hours above the tree line, exposed, visible, with no cover if infected wandered through, or if the cold decided to kill me faster than the math said it should. The ground's frozen, I said. How do I anchor the mast? Rock cairn at the base, guy wires to 3 anchor points. There are boulders at the site. I scouted it before the fever. The notebook has the layout. And the feed line? That's a 400-meter run through snow. Lay it on the surface. The signal loss over that distance at these frequencies is acceptable. Not ideal, but acceptable. I closed the notebook, set it on the footlocker. I need to think about this, I said. I know. I went outside and the morning was brutal and clear. Blue sky so bright it hurt after the dim interior. The snow around the cabin was wind-packed and glittering. I could see the ridge above me, a long spine of rock and stunted pine, maybe 300 feet higher in elevation. The X on Vasquez's map would be up there somewhere. I stood in the cold and ran the calculation that had governed every decision I'd made for 200 days. Risk versus exposure, visibility versus movement, the arithmetic of being alone. If I raised that antenna and powered the radio, anyone within 60 miles would know something was alive in these mountains. The settlement to the east, survivors I hadn't encountered, and if any fragment of military structure still existed. If Oberg had reached Lewis McCord, if some chain of command was still processing names, they would hear a signal coming from coordinates associated with the deserter. But standing in that snow, looking at the sky, I felt the arithmetic start to shift. Not because the risk had changed, because I was realizing that the risk had always been the same. I hadn't been calculating danger for 6 months. I'd been calculating what it would cost to matter again. Disappearing is easy, not physically. Physically, it's the hardest thing I've ever done. But psychologically, it's a relief. You stop making choices that affect other people. You stop carrying the weight of consequence. You are a closed circuit. No input, no output, no debt. Raising that antenna would make me a circuit with endpoints again. I went back inside and told Vasquez I'd do it in the morning when I'd had a full meal and rest and could move at my strongest. He nodded. He didn't thank me. He didn't argue the timeline. He just nodded and closed his eyes, and I spent the rest of the day eating MREs and reading his notebook until I could see the diagrams behind my eyelids. I woke at first light. Vasquez was awake before me, sitting upright with visible effort. The green notebook open on his lap. He'd added something overnight. A page of notes in handwriting that trembled but remained legible. Revised frequency list, he said, based on what I heard before the fever. The settlement signal was strongest on 148.3 megahertz. Start there. I copied the frequency onto my forearm with a marker from the supply container. Back up to the notebook, back up to my memory. Redundancy. The signal NCO's religion. The antenna sections were where his logbook said. Stacked outside the door under a tarp weighed down with rocks. 6 pine poles, each roughly 4 feet long and 3 inches in diameter, stripped of bark, dried, straight enough. The lashing wire was pre-cut and coiled at the base. The dipole element. 2 lengths of copper wire, each about 38 inches, was wound around a stick, with the center feed point already soldered to the transmission line. Vasquez had done everything except the last physical act. Everything except the walking and the lifting, and the standing in the wind. I assembled the mast horizontally in the snow beside the cabin, lashing the sections with the wire wraps he'd pre-measured. It took 40 minutes. The finished mast was about 20 feet long and heavy enough that carrying it would mean both hands occupied, no rifle accessible. I tied the rifle across my pack and accepted it. The guy wires, Vasquez said from the doorway. He dragged himself there on the cot's sleeping bag, which he'd spread on the floor as a sled. The effort had left him gray-faced and panting. 3 of them. Attach before you raise the mast. Pre-tension them to the boulders, then walk it up. I read the notebook. Read it again. I didn't resent the repetition. He wasn't being condescending. He was being a sergeant. Sergeants repeat things because privates die when they assume they remember. I coiled the 3 guy wires, clipped them to my pack, slung the coil of feed line over my shoulder, and lifted the mast. It balanced awkwardly across both arms, the front end drooping. I'd have to walk with it like a medieval jousting lance, angled upward, pushing through snow that was thigh-deep in places. Marin. I turned. Vasquez was leaning against the doorframe. He looked like something the mountain was already reclaiming. Sunken eyes, cracked lips, the wool blanket around his shoulders, like a shroud in progress. If I'm not here when you get back, he said, the notebook has everything. You don't need me for the rest. You'll be here. If I'm not, the notebook. I nodded. Then I started climbing. The ridgeline was 400 meters away. In normal conditions on flat ground, that's a 5-minute walk. In thigh-deep snow on a mountain slope, carrying a 20-foot mast and 40 pounds of wire and hardware, it took 2 hours and 14 minutes. I know because I counted, not for the log, for the same reason I counted days, because numbers are the last things that stay solid when everything else goes soft. The route followed Vasquez's hand-drawn map almost exactly. He'd marked the path with small cairns. 3 rocks stacked. At intervals, though several were buried and I had to probe with my boot to find them. The snow was deeper in the hollows between terrain features, shallower on the exposed spine of the ridge. I learned to read the surface. Smooth and wind-polished meant shallow, safe to cross. Soft and textured meant deep, possibly bottomless. At the halfway point, I set the mast down and rested. The wind was steady at maybe 15 miles per hour, cold enough to burn exposed skin in minutes. I'd wrapped my face in a scarf made from a cut sleeve, and ice had formed where my breath condensed on the fabric. My hands were functional but would need warming soon. The gloves from the supply container were wool inserts, not winter combat gloves. Adequate for the cabin, marginal for extended exposure. I ate a cracker and a piece of pressed fruit from an emery, drank water from my canteen, which was already developing ice crystals at the mouth. I looked back downhill. The cabin was invisible. Buried under snow, no smoke from the chimney because I'd let the stove die to prevent Vasquez from trying to tend it and falling. Just a white slope, undifferentiated. If I didn't already know where the door was, I'd walk right over it. That was the point, I realized. Whoever built this cache in the 60s had chosen the location for concealment. Not from zombies, from Soviet reconnaissance, a shelter invisible from the air, on a route that would let small units move through the mountains after a nuclear exchange, maintaining communication relays that could function when everything else was gone. 60 years later, the scenario had changed and the purpose hadn't. A relay point in the mountains, a signal where there was silence, a voice where the frequencies were dead. I picked up the mast and kept climbing. The antenna site was exactly where Vasquez had marked it, a rocky outcrop jutting from the ridgeline, swept mostly clear of snow by the wind. 3 boulders formed a natural triangle about 8 feet across. In the center, a patch of bare rock. The view was immense. I could see the Bitterroot Valley stretching east, the mountain ranges folding south and west, everything white and silent under a sky that was starting to cloud from the northwest. Weather coming, maybe 12 hours out, maybe less. I had to work fast. The boulders served as anchor points for the guy wires. I chipped holes in the rock with the entrenching tool, wedged wire loops into the cracks, and tightened them with pliers. 3 anchors, 3 wires, evenly spaced at 120 degrees. Then I attached the guy wires to the mast at the 2/3 point, lay the mast flat with its base against the center rock, attached the dipole element at the top, and ran the feed line down the mast and out along the snow toward the cabin. Raising the mast alone was the part I'd been dreading. 20 feet of pine pole, even at 3 inches diameter, is heavy. The technique Vasquez described in the notebook, walk it up, meant starting at the top end, lifting it overhead, and walking toward the base hand over hand as the mast pivoted upward, like raising a flagpole. Simple with 2 people, dangerous with 1 because the balance point shifts as the mast goes vertical, and if it tips past center, it's gone. I positioned myself, lifted the top end, walked it up. The guy wires tightened as the mast rose, which was the design. They limited the swing so it couldn't overshoot. At about 70 degrees, I felt the wires take the load, and the mast settled into vertical with a vibration I felt through my boots. It stood, swaying slightly in the wind, the copper dipole catching light at the top. The guy wires humming, 20 feet of pine and wire rising above the ridgeline for the first time in 60 years of silence. I secured the base with a rock cairn, checked the guy wire tension, and started running the feed line downhill. 400 meters of wire, laid on the snow surface. It took another hour. By the time I reached the cabin, the clouds had moved in and the temperature was dropping. Vasquez was on the floor. Not dead. Not yet. He'd slid from the doorway and lay on his side on the sleeping bag, one arm extended toward the radio shelf, as though reaching for something he couldn't get to. His eyes were open. His breathing was audible from the door. A crackling, labored sound that belonged in a hospital, not a buried cabin in the Bitterroot Range. I dropped my pack, knelt beside him, and got his head elevated on a folded blanket. His skin was hot despite the cold room. Fever was burning through whatever the expired antibiotics might have been doing. "Antennas up," I said. He focused on me, slowly. Height? 20 feet. Dipoles oriented east-west like the notebook said. Feed lines run. Connect it. I went to the radio. The PRC-77 was heavy, battered, and old enough to be in a museum, but Vasquez had maintained it. The connectors were clean, the battery terminals greased. I attached the feed line to the antenna port, connected the hand crank generator to the power input, and sat in front of it. 40 minutes of cranking, Vasquez said from the floor. Get you 12 minutes of transmit. Don't waste it. Scan first. Confirm the settlement signal on 148.3. Then broadcast. Broadcast what? Position. Number of survivors. Request for contact. Keep it simple. Keep it repeating. I started cranking. The generator resisted at first. Cold, stiffened gears. Then smoothed out. The rhythm was steady, monotonous, physical. My arm burned after 10 minutes. I switched hands. The power meter on the radio crept upward. While I cranked, Vasquez talked. Not about the antenna, not about the radio, about Whitmore. Nobody came after you, he said. I kept cranking. Diaz logged you as AWOL, wrote your name in the book, moved on. Next morning, 3 more people were gone. By the time the convoy came, 12 soldiers had left. You weren't the first, you weren't the last, you weren't even discussed. I kept cranking. My eyes burned, and not from the cold. I know you've been carrying it, he said. Running from something that wasn't behind you. Building a whole survival system around a threat that doesn't exist. You don't know what I've been carrying. I was a sergeant, Marin. I've seen privates carry impossible things because nobody told them they could set them down. The power meter hit the threshold. The radio was live. I stopped cranking and turned the frequency dial to 148.3 megahertz. Static, dense, hissing, undifferentiated. I adjusted the squelch. The static thinned. Underneath it, like a voice heard through a waterfall, a pattern, rhythmic, repeating. I fine-tuned the dial, and the signal cleared enough to resolve. A man's voice, calm, recorded, looping. This is Elk River Community, broadcasting on 148.3 megahertz. GPS coordinates follow. 46 degrees, 12 minutes north. 114 degrees, 8 minutes west. We are a civilian settlement of approximately 90 people. We have shelter, food production, and medical capability. All survivors are welcome. Repeat, all survivors are welcome. This message repeats every 30 minutes. 90 people, medical capability. 60 miles east if the coordinates were right. I looked at Vasquez. He'd heard it too. His eyes were brighter than they'd been in 2 days. Not healthier, but present. Focused. Your turn, he said. I held the transmit key for a long moment before pressing it. The radio was warm under my fingers. A machine designed in the 1960s to survive nuclear war, still functioning 60 years later in a different apocalypse, about to carry my voice to anyone listening. My voice. The voice I'd silenced for 61 days. The voice of a deserter, a cable runner, a woman whose survival strategy was predicated entirely on not being heard. You'll have about 12 minutes, Vasquez said. Transmit for 30 seconds, release, listen for 60. Repeat. If they're monitoring, they'll hear you within 2 cycles. I pressed the key. Elk River Community. This is PFC Marinalt, transmitting from a military relay point in the Bitterroot Range, approximately 60 miles west of your stated coordinates. 2 survivors at this location. 1 with severe respiratory illness requiring medical attention. We have limited supplies, requesting contact and guidance. We'll monitor this frequency. Over. I released the key. The silence that followed was different from every silence I'd lived inside for 200 days. Those silences were closed, sealed, self-contained. A room with no windows. This silence was open. A door I'd just pushed ajar with no way to pull it shut. 60 seconds of static. I transmitted again. Same message, same flat, careful tone. My voice was steadier this time. The vocal cords were remembering their job. 40 seconds of static, then a break, a click, and a woman's voice, clear enough to understand but scratchy with distance. Relay point, this is Elk River. We copy your transmission, confirm 2 survivors, 1 medical. Can you provide specifics on the medical situation? Over. I felt something crack inside my chest that wasn't physical. Someone had answered. Someone had been listening. Someone had responded to my voice with their own voice. And the world had just expanded from a steel box in the snow to a space that included other people who were alive and organized and asking questions. Elk River, respiratory infection, likely pneumonia, high fever, fluid in lungs. Patient has been symptomatic for approximately 1 week. We have expired broad-spectrum antibiotics, no other medical supplies of significance. Patient is non-ambulatory. Over. A pause. Murmured voices in the background on their end. Multiple people conferring. Relay point, we have a physician and basic pharmacy. We can organize a recovery team, but 60 miles through mountain terrain in winter will take time. Estimated 4 to 5 days by snowshoe with a travois. Can the patient sustain that window? Over. I looked at Vasquez. He'd heard the question. 4 to 5 days. He shook his head. Not dramatically, just a small, honest motion. The kind of gesture that requires no translation. He didn't think he had 4 to 5 days, and looking at him, the color, the breathing, the way his body was consuming itself to fuel the fever. I didn't think so either. Elk River, uncertain. We will maintain this relay and provide updates. Over. Copy, relay point. Recovery team will depart at first light. Maintain frequency. Elk River out. The radio went quiet. I sat back on the floor, my hands still resting on the transmit key, and breathed. Vasquez spoke from behind me. Leave the relay active. What? The antenna, the radio, leave them running. When the generator runs down, crank it again. Keep the relay point alive after I'm gone. You're not? Marin. His voice was stripped of everything except precision. The sergeant's voice, but without rank behind it. Just clarity. I'm a signal NCO. My whole career was making sure people could talk to each other. This relay is the last thing I'll build. Don't let it go dark. I didn't answer because answering would have meant accepting the premise, and I wasn't ready to accept it. Instead, I cranked the generator again. 40 minutes. 12 more minutes of power. I transmitted a second message, a general broadcast this time, not aimed at Elk River, but at anyone. This is a military communication relay point in the Bitterroot Range, Montana, transmitting on 148.3 megahertz. 2 survivors at this location. We are monitoring this frequency. Any station hearing this transmission, please respond. Nothing for 2 minutes, then faint, overlapping with static. A voice. Male. Young. Relay, this is Group of 7, Highway 93 corridor. Can you repeat your position? My hands were shaking. I repeated the coordinates. The voice came back, slightly clearer. Copy. We've been moving north for 2 weeks. We didn't know anyone was alive up here. Can you relay to the settlement? And there it was. The purpose Vasquez had built toward. Not just a radio. A relay. A node in a network that didn't exist yet. Someone on Highway 93 who couldn't reach Elk River directly, reaching me, and through me reaching them. A connection that existed only because a dying signal NCO had spent 36 days building an antenna he couldn't raise, and a deserter had raised it for him. Highway 93 group, stand by, I said. Elk River, this is the Bitterroot relay. New contact. Group of 7 on Highway 93 corridor, moving north. Requesting guidance to your location. Can you advise? Over. Elk River responded within 30 seconds. They had directions, waypoints. They'd guided people before. I relayed the information, and the voice on Highway 93 copied it back. And for 6 minutes, I sat in a buried cabin next to a dying man and did the job I'd been trained for. I connected people who couldn't reach each other. When the power died, I sat in the silence and cried. Not quietly, not with restraint. I cried the way you cry when something that's been locked for 6 months breaks open and you can't control what comes out. Vasquez didn't say anything. He just lay on the floor and let me. The fever took him to a place I couldn't follow that night. He was conscious in intervals, eyes open, words forming, but the intervals shortened and the spaces between them filled with a muttering delirium that mixed radio frequencies with names I didn't recognize. He called for Tran once. He called for someone named Elena twice. He never called for me. I kept the stove going. I gave him water when he could swallow. I sat beside him and read the green notebook again. Not for information this time, but because it was his voice on paper, and I wanted his voice to continue existing in some form while the one in his throat was failing. The notebook wasn't just technical. Between the antenna diagrams and frequency charts, there were entries, not a diary. Vasquez wasn't the type, more like annotations on being alive. Day 170. Heard an owl last night. First animal sound in weeks that wasn't a rodent. Owls survived. That means prey survived. That means the food chain didn't collapse. That means something. Day 178. The dipole math works out. If I can get the mast to 20 feet, the signal should clear the eastern ridgeline. That's the whole problem. 20 feet of height. The difference between heard and unheard is 20 vertical feet. Day 184. Fever starting. Took the last of the acetaminophen. Funny that the thing that stops me isn't the dead or the cold or the loneliness. It's a bacterial infection, the most ordinary killer in human history. Day 191. Can't lift the mass sections. Tried twice. Fell both times. Going to write everything down in case someone comes after me. The relay is bigger than me. It was always bigger than me. I closed the notebook. Vasquez. His eyes open, glassy, distant. Were you looking for me? A long pause. His lips moved before the sound came. No. Were you looking for anyone from Whitmore? No. Why did you come up here? He swallowed, winced. The act of swallowing was painful now. Same reason you did. I left. I ran. I ended up in the mountains because the mountains don't ask you to be anything. But you built the relay. That was after. His breathing was deteriorating, each sentence costing visible effort. Building the relay was me deciding to stop running, deciding that being found was worth being useful. And before that? Before that, I was you, exactly you, walking ridge lines, eating pine bark, counting days, thinking I was being hunted, thinking my absence mattered enough for someone to chase. He coughed, blood on his lips this time. I wiped it with a cloth. Nobody chased me either, he said. That's the joke. We both ran from nothing. The only thing chasing us was the idea that we were important enough to chase. I replaced the cloth, gave him water. His hand gripped mine for a moment. Not affection, not desperation, just contact. The simple circuit of one person touching another. Keep the relay alive, he said again. I will. He held my hand for a few more seconds, then his grip relaxed, and he slid back into the delirium, and I sat with him through the night while the stove ticked and the wind howled above the buried roof. Vasquez died at dawn on day 202. The breathing changed first. The rattles softened, which I initially mistook for improvement, until I realized the softening meant his lungs no longer had the force to push air through the fluid. Then his breathing became shallow, then intermittent, then stopped. I checked his pulse. Nothing. I waited 5 minutes and checked again. Nothing. I waited 10 more minutes because the infection doesn't reanimate that fast. From what I'd observed, the turn takes between 20 minutes and 6 hours, depending on factors nobody alive understood. And after 10 minutes, he was still. Just still. Just a body doing what bodies do when they're done. He didn't turn. He died of pneumonia, and the pneumonia wasn't the infection, and whatever pathogen made the dead walk apparently required a specific transmission vector that Vasquez hadn't encountered. He was just dead. Ordinary dead. The kind of dead that humans had been for thousands of years before the outbreak. I covered him with the wool blanket. I took his dog tags. I took the green notebook. I left him in the cabin because the ground was frozen and I had no way to dig a grave, and because the cabin was already underground, already buried, already a sealed space. It wasn't a grave, but it could be one. I didn't cry. I'd used that up the night before. What I did was crank the generator. 40 minutes of handle rotation, my arm aching, my eyes on the power meter. When it hit threshold, I keyed the radio. Elk River, this is the Bitterroot relay. Staff Sergeant Vasquez died this morning. One survivor remaining at this location. The relay is operational. I'll maintain it. Over. A pause, then the woman's voice. Relay, we copy. We're sorry. Recovery team is 12 hours out. Can you sustain until their arrival? I can sustain. Copy. We'll keep this frequency monitored. Hang on, Marin. She used my name. I hadn't realized I'd given it, but I must have in the first transmission. PFC Marin Alt. My name. Broadcast on a frequency anyone could hear. The name I'd been hiding for 200 days. Now loose in the airwaves, bouncing off ionosphere layers. Maybe reaching ears I'd never know about. Good. They came in the afternoon of day 203. 4 people on snowshoes, pulling a sled loaded with supplies. I heard them before I saw them. The crunch of compacted snow under broad frames. Voices carrying in the cold air. I stood at the cabin door with my rifle, because 200 days doesn't vanish in a day, and watched them approach. 3 men, 1 woman, winter gear, civilian, well-maintained. The lead man was tall, bearded, maybe 50, moving with the efficiency of someone who'd spent real time in snow country. He raised a hand when he saw me. Marin? Yeah. I'm Gil, Elk River. We brought medical supplies and food. I lowered the rifle, not because I trusted them, because the act of lowering it was the decision to try. They entered the cabin. Gil assessed Vasquez's body with a clinical calm that told me he'd seen death before the outbreak. One of the men, younger, with a medic's bag, confirmed what I already knew. Pneumonia, untreated, fatal. Nothing exotic, nothing supernatural. Just the old-fashioned kind of dying that modern medicine had made so rare we'd forgotten it could happen. They wrapped Vasquez properly. Gil asked if I wanted to say anything. I said no, then said yes, then stood over the wool-wrapped shape and said, he built this, all of it, the antenna, the relay, the plan. I just carried it uphill. Gil nodded. That's usually how it works. They loaded the sled with the supplies from the cabin. Gil asked about the radio. It stays, I said. The relay stays active. That was his condition. The only thing he asked. We can run it remotely. Set up a solar trickle charger. The antenna's solid. With maintenance, it'll function for years. You've done this before? Set up relay points? 3 so far. Yours makes 4. We're building a network. Small, slow, but real. A network. Multiple relay points connecting scattered survivors across the mountains. The thing Vasquez had imagined from his dying chair, already happening at a scale he didn't know about. He heard your signal, I said. Your settlement broadcast. That's why he built the relay here, to extend your range. We know. That's why we responded so fast when you called. We'd been hoping someone would activate this corridor. We just didn't know who or when. I looked at the radio on its shelf, the green notebook on the footlocker, the frequency card taped to the wall. I want to keep doing this, I said. Gil looked at me, waiting. Signal support. That's what I was trained for. I want to keep building relays. It was the first voluntary statement about my future I'd made in 200 days. Not a plan for tomorrow, not a survival calculation for the next week. A statement about what I wanted to do with the time I had, addressed to another person, requiring their participation to become real. Gil smiled slightly. We need signal people. Then you have one. The walk to Elk River took 3 days. Gil and his team set a pace that accounted for my condition. I was stronger than Vasquez had been, but weaker than I realized. Months of caloric deficit and isolation having taken a toll my adrenaline had been masking. The first day I flagged by noon. They adjusted without comment. On the trail I talked. Not much at first. Sentences felt like a skill I was relearning. In the rhythm of conversation, the give and take, the pauses, the reading of another person's face, was foreign after so long alone. But the medic, whose name was Darren, walked beside me and asked questions in a way that required only short answers, and the short answers gradually lengthened. And by the second day, I was telling him about the ridgelines, the pine bark, the porcupine, the 61 days of silence. "Did you hear anything?" he asked. "Radio traffic, I mean, before you found the cabin." "Almost nothing. By day 150, the frequencies were dead." "They're not dead," he said. "They're just quiet. You were scanning military bands, right? Those went silent early. The civilian bands. Ham radio, FRS, GMRS. Those are active. Scattered, low power, but people are talking. People are talking." Such a simple statement. Such an unimaginable one. On the third morning, we crested a ridge and I saw Elk River below. Not a town. The actual town had been somewhere nearby, but was gone now, burned or overrun or just empty. The settlement was built into a bend of a frozen river, using a cluster of buildings, a school, a church, what looked like a feed store, as the core, with additions spreading outward in concentric rings of insulation and fortification. Smoke rose from multiple chimneys. I could see people moving between structures, small figures against the snow, but moving with purpose, not stumbling. Living. 93 people, Gil corrected. 3 more than the broadcast said. They'd arrived last week from the south, guided by a relay point I hadn't built. We descended, at the perimeter. A fence of stacked logs and wire. A woman with a clipboard met us. She was older, gray-haired, wrapped in a parka that dwarfed her. She wrote my name on her clipboard, Marin Olt, added to a list. I flinched when I saw her writing it. 200 days of erasing myself, and here was a person putting me back on a record. "You all right?" she asked. I breathed, consciously, deliberately. "Yeah," I said. "I'm all right." Inside the perimeter, someone handed me a bowl of soup. Actual soup. Broth with root vegetables and some kind of dried meat, hot enough to steam in the cold air. I held it with both hands and stood in the middle of people who were eating and working and living in a way that I'd spent 6 months telling myself wasn't possible anymore. A man at a workbench was repairing a pair of snowshoes. A woman was teaching a group of children in the school building. I could see them through the window, seated at desks, looking at a whiteboard. A teenager was stacking firewood with the methodical efficiency of someone who'd done it every day for months. Ordinary acts. The ordinary machinery of people choosing to continue. I drank the soup. It was the best thing I'd ever tasted, and I knew that was partly malnutrition and partly something else. The flavor of being inside a community again, of being handed something warm by someone who didn't need anything from me in return. I found Gil later that afternoon. He was in the feed store, which had been converted into a communications center. 2 radios, a bank of car batteries wired in series, and a map on the wall showing the mountain corridors with relay points marked as red dots. 4 dots, the newest one, the Bitterroot relay, was unlabeled. I picked up a marker and wrote next to it, Vasquez Station. Gil watched me do it, didn't object. "When can I start?" I asked. "Tomorrow if you want. We've identified 6 potential relay sites that need scouting. Terrain surveys, antenna planning, frequency allocation. It's the same work your sergeant was doing, just at scale." "He wasn't my sergeant," I said. "I wasn't under his command. We just happened to be from the same place." "And now you're finishing what he started." I looked at the map. 6 potential sites. 6 empty corridors where survivors might be walking in silence, scanning dead frequencies, believing they were alone. 6 places where 20 feet of pine and copper wire could mean the difference between heard and unheard. "Yeah," I said, "I am. I've been at Elk River for 17 days now. I eat meals I didn't prepare, in a room with people whose names I'm still learning. I sleep in a building with a roof I didn't clear the snow from. I talk every day, and my voice no longer sounds like a machine turning on after a long shutdown. I crank the relay radio at Vasquez Station once every 3 days. Gil's team installed a small solar panel that handles the rest, but I go up there anyway. I check the guy wires, I check the feed line, I sit in the cabin where Vasquez died and I transmit. Last week, a family of 4 reached Elk River from the west. They'd heard the relay broadcast. Not Elk River's signal directly, but my retransmission from the ridge. They said the voice on the radio was the first human sound they'd heard in 3 months. They said it was a woman's voice, calm, repeating coordinates, and the words, "All survivors are welcome." They didn't know my name. They didn't need to. But they heard me. The relay is bigger than me. It was always bigger than me. Vasquez wrote that in his notebook, and he was right. But someone has to crank the handle. Someone has to carry the mast uphill. Someone has to press the key and speak into the silence and wait. I stopped running on day 200, not because I stopped being afraid, because I found out there was nothing behind me, and that the only direction that mattered was the one where someone might be listening.